I overheard the Alpha King laugh at my moon seal with another woman, so I left to marry the Dragon King. A complete story. There is a kind of silence that lives inside a person for years before they even know it is there. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of emptiness. The silence of someone who has learned, very carefully and very thoroughly, to take up exactly as much space as she has been given and not 1 inch more. The silence of a woman who has been told, not in words, never in words, words would have been almost easier, but in every arrangement of every room she has ever entered, in every pause before her name was spoken, in every glance that moved past her to settle on something the room considered worth settling on, that the correct posture is small. Seraphine Ashwood had been carrying that silence since she was 17 years old. The year the moon seal appeared, she had woken on an ordinary morning in early spring, cold gray light through the stone window, mountain air still carrying the tail end of winter in its edges, thin and sharp the way air at elevation is always thin and sharp, and found it there on her collarbone, without preamble, without ceremony, without any warning that she had been given and not paid enough attention to. A silver spiral, faint as the reflection of starlight on still water, tightening at the center, and opening outward in a pattern that felt both deliberate and ancient, like something that had decided to stop waiting for a better morning and had simply arrived. Her mother came in with the morning tea and stopped in the doorway, set the cup down on the dresser without looking at where she was setting it, crossed the room with 3 steps that were not quite steady, sat on the edge of the bed, pressed both hands flat over her mouth, and looked at the mark on her daughter's collarbone, and wept. Not the weeping of fear, not quite the weeping of grief, but the weeping of a person who has been bracing for something for a long time and is finally being given confirmation that they were right to brace. "What is it?" Seraphine had asked. Her mother had not answered directly. She had taken Seraphine's face in both her hands and looked at her for a long moment, the way you look at a person when you are memorizing the shape of them, when you are aware, on some specific and not quite nameable level, that things are about to change, and you want to be sure you have the before of them somewhere safe and certain inside you before it does. Then she had said, quietly and very precisely, "Be careful, my love. Be very, very careful with this." Her mother had died the following winter, before Seraphine had thought to ask what she meant, before she had understood how to ask, before she had known enough to understand what kind of careful her mother was warning toward, or what the careful was protecting against, or why her mother's eyes had held that specific look. Not pride exactly, not fear exactly, but something that sat in the difficult country between those two things and looked out from both sides of the border at once. She had carried the question for 8 years, along with the silence, along with the mark on her collarbone that the wolf scholars at court glanced at and then looked past with the smooth efficiency of people who have already decided something does not require their attention. She was 25 now. The seal had not faded. It had deepened, the silver more present than it had been at 17, slightly luminous on nights when the moon sat full and low over the northern mountains, visible against her skin even through thin fabric, catching candlelight and firelight and the cold indifferent light of stars with equal ease, and returning each of them slowly, the way fine stone returns warmth long after the sun has moved on. A living thing, undeniable. Beautiful in the particular way that things are beautiful when you have been with them long enough to stop being self-conscious about them. The court of King Kalen Voss had spent 8 years teaching her to be self-conscious about it. Not through cruelty. She was careful about this distinction. She thought the distinction mattered even when the outcome was the same. Not through active opposition or mockery or the pointed unkindness of deliberate dismissal. Through the more durable and more deniable instrument of consistent indifference. No one had studied the seal. No one had gathered the scholars, examined the relevant texts, asked what historical records said about spiral markings that appeared on young women without explanation or precedent. The seal had been noted once, by the High Advisor, in a tone that suggested he was noting it the way he would note an unusual weather event, observed, recorded, filed under categories requiring no follow-up action, and then it had been administratively set aside, and Seraphine set aside alongside it, in the specific manner this court had perfected, present, maintained, given quarters and an allowance and access to the palace library, and then arranged around rather than engaged with. She was an Omega. The wolf hierarchy was old, and in the court of King Kalen Voss it was taken with the dead seriousness of a thing that has never been seriously questioned by anyone whose questioning would have mattered. Omegas occupied the lowest formal rank, not servants, not without standing, included in court life by tradition rather than active necessity. Useful in the way that certain fixtures are useful. Present, functional, noticed only in absence, not the sort of thing anyone builds a decision around. What made Seraphine's position specific, and strange, and quietly persistently painful was Kalen, King Kalen Voss, Alpha of Alphas, ruler of the Northern Mountain Territories. Her fated mate, by the bond's own choosing, which was not something either of them had asked for or consented to, the old wolf magic having never been particularly interested in consent. The bond connected them. She felt it as a low, constant hum, present the way background noise is present, the way you notice it most in the moments it shifts, slightly, and then realize how long it had been there. She had always felt it. She had never been certain he did. He had never formally rejected her. This was the fact she kept returning to with the regularity of a habit she had not quite managed to break. Formal rejection, the specific ritual, the spoken words, the severing of the old magic through the proper channels, would have dissolved the bond, given them both something clean. Let Seraphine become simply another Omega in the lower court, with no particular connection to the man at the top of everything, free to arrange her life around something other than the specific absence of someone who had decided she wasn't worth acknowledging. He had not done that. What he had done instead was the quieter thing, the thing that cost him nothing and cost her 8 years. He had simply proceeded, continued with his life, as if the bond were a feature of the architecture, present, structural, something you navigate around rather than engage with directly. And there was Lyrian. Lyrian Vale occupied the position of the king's companion with the ease of someone who had been practicing for that exact role since before she understood what it required. She was alpha-blooded, politically precise, carrying the specific combination of qualities that this court pointed to when it wanted to demonstrate that it understood what power ought to pair with. She was at Kalen's side in every public appearance, every feast, every ceremony, every formal proceeding, every diplomatic function. She wore the position the way certain people wear fine clothes, with the naturalness of someone for whom the fit has never needed adjustment, because the garment was made with them specifically in mind. Seraphine had watched all of this from the library and the lower rooms and the edges of rooms she was technically permitted to be in. She had watched it, and she had told herself, for years, that patience was a form of loyalty, that the bond would eventually become too significant to ignore, that the seal would eventually be studied and its meaning understood, that one day Kalen would look at her, not past her, not through her, but at her, with the specific attention of a man who has decided that what he's looking at is worth his time. She had believed this with the small, stubborn, quietly desperate hope of someone who has decided that the alternative to hope is too cold to live in. The east corridor put the fire out. It was late. The palace had done its midnight settling, servants finished, lanterns turned down, the particular quality of stillness that belongs to large buildings in the hours between midnight and dawn, when they stop being occupied and start being simply inhabited. Seraphine had gone to the library the way she always went, on nights when sleep refused her, quietly, robe over her nightgown, hair loosened, moving through familiar corridors with the ease of someone who has walked the same route so many times it has become an extension of her own body. She heard voices before she saw the light. The sitting room off the east corridor, usually locked at this hour, had its door half open. Warm light through the gap, cutting a line across the cold stone floor. 2 voices. She recognized them before her mind had caught up with the recognition, the way you recognize things that have been part of your landscape for long enough that they register below the level of thought. She should have kept walking. She would have kept walking. She believed this about herself, but she heard her own name, or what passed for her name in this court, the Omega Girl, spoken with the ease of people who have never been told there was a reason to be more specific, and her feet stopped. Lyrian's voice first, lighter, more precise. She was speaking about the moon seal, about the scholars at the high table, about something she described as another generation of Omega self-mythology. The word fable, the phrase, "You cannot keep managing it so delicately." Then Kalen, and then he laughed. Not the controlled social laugh of a public gathering. Not the short, sharp laugh of surprise. The comfortable laugh, the private one. The one that lives in a person only when they are completely at ease, when the performance of being a king has been set aside, when they are with someone they trust entirely and are not thinking about how they sound because there is no one to sound like anything for. She had heard that laugh before, at a distance, and it had always made her feel the specific longing of someone standing outside a lit window, looking in at warmth she wasn't part of. She did not feel longing now. He said, "It is a birthmark. A striking one, I grant you. But the old women of the Omega lines have been weaving prophecy into their daughters' marks for 3 centuries at least. They need it to mean something. The alternative, that it doesn't, is harder to live with. I understand the impulse. I am simply not building a reign around it." Lyrian said something Seraphine couldn't quite catch. Softer, lower. The murmur of a person settled into a conversation they feel entirely safe in. Kalen again. The bond exists. The old magic produces it when it produces it, and I cannot dissolve it without a process that carries its own political complications at present. But existence and significance are different things entirely. The Omega girl holds a position in this court. She is adequate to her position. She is not a consideration in how I govern. Quote, the word adequate, she would think about that word later, would carry it south on the mountain road, would turn it over in the riding hours, the way you turn over a stone, not expecting to find anything different underneath, but doing it because the motion is familiar. Adequate. The word you use for things that function, but that you have not thought about particularly carefully. The word for things that are present, and do not cause problems, and do not require your attention. She heard no more after that. Her legs carried her back to her room, before her mind had caught up with the mechanics of walking. She found herself sitting on the edge of her bed with no clear recollection of the distance between the corridor and this moment. The moon seal caught the moonlight through the window. Silver, steady, completely indifferent to what had just happened. She pressed 2 fingers against it, felt the warmth, not the warmth of skin, not body heat, but the deeper warmth of something that has been holding heat from a source too far down to see. She had carried this warmth for 8 years, had let it mean something, had let it be evidence of something larger than what the court had decided she was. She did not cry. She sat in the quiet, and she felt the specific internal sensation of a belief letting go. Not shattering. She was past the age of shattering, just releasing. The way a hand releases something it has been holding too long, not because it has given up, but because it has finally understood that holding on is not the same thing as keeping. The belief had been, he will look, eventually, and he will see. It was gone, and in the cold space it left behind, she found something she had not expected. Clarity. By the time the pre-dawn gray began at the edges of the window, 4 hours after she had sat down on the edge of the bed, she had made every decision she needed to make. She would leave before the palace stirred. She would leave no letter. She had drafted 3 of them in her mind over those hours. The angry version, the dignified version, the carefully comprehensive version that laid out every piece of evidence in precise logical order, and she discarded all 3. Letters, even the most controlled ones, were still a form of reaching. She had nothing left to reach with. The absence of a letter was the only honest remaining sentence. She packed small, 3 changes of practical clothes. Her 4 books, the ones she had carried from her mother's house 8 years ago and added to over time, worn and marked, and hers. The carved wolf figurine her mother had pressed into her hands the morning of her first departure, soft wood, worn smooth at the edges, from 8 years of being held in the small hours. A pouch of coin she had been adding to quietly for years, without quite examining why. The specific saving of a woman who understands, on a level below language, that a day might come when having a reserve is not optional. And a diplomatic letter. 3 months before this morning, A formal summons had arrived from the Dragon Kingdom, King Draven's Soul, requesting a representative from the Alpha King's court for treaty negotiations. The Dragon territories held resources the Wolf Kingdoms depended on in specific ways: firestone, volcanic minerals, the rare herbs that grew only in soil that had been lava within living memory. The letter had been careful and formal, written in the manner of ancient enemies, attempting the first tentative grammar of a different relationship. Kalen had read it, handed it off, said something dismissive. Seraphine had read it after he set it down. 3 times. Not with a plan, with the feeling of a door that had not yet been opened, which is a very different thing from a door that is locked. She walked through it before sunrise. Plain clothes, servant's gate. Her bag over one shoulder, moving through the mountain pre-dawn with the specific quality of presence she had developed over 8 years of being invisible when the court needed her to be. Without urgency, without the self-consciousness of a woman with a destination, with the ease that reads as belonging and attracts no questions. She was on the road before the first proper light. She bought a horse at the post house a mile from the palace. A bay mare, honest-faced, steady-gaited. She bought rather than hired, because she was not coming back. She did not look at the mountain behind her. The road south was 3 days on horseback at a sensible pace. She kept a sensible pace, stopping at post houses at night, using the riding hours the way she had always used sustained solitude, for organizing. Taking the facts of the situation and putting each one in the correct place, the way a librarian organizes books, systematically, without sentiment, finding where each thing belongs in relation to everything else. She had left a court. She had left a bond she had not chosen and had never been truly offered. She had a skill set that was real and specific. She had a mark on her collarbone that the wolf world had decided to dismiss, and the dragon world, based on what she knew of their scholarship, had considered significant for centuries. These were the facts. She worked with them. She arrived at the Dragon Kingdom's outer border on the afternoon of the 3rd day and felt the landscape change beneath her, as if the land itself were doing the work of transition she had not quite let herself do. The wolf territories had been vertical. Mountains, towers, structures that climb toward the sky in the specific manner of power that needs to be seen from a distance, that is not content to simply be, but must also be visible being. The dragon territories were the opposite. The soil changed first. Volcanic black, deep textured, carrying a mineral warmth in it that wasn't unpleasant, just unexpected. Then the air shifted, picking up something between earth and heat that she would later understand was the scent of this place at its most itself. Then the flatness gave way to depth, valleys that appeared without announcement, rock formations of deep black and warm amber that seemed to have grown upward from somewhere far below, rather than been placed on the surface by anything as casual as time. The palace sat in the deepest valley, not tall, wide, spread across the valley floor as if it had decided to be part of the land rather than separate from it. Dark stone shot through, with veins of firestone that glowed amber in the afternoon light, holding their own warmth, breathing it back out slowly. She stood at the valley's edge and looked at it, and felt, despite everything, the specific feeling of arrival. Not homecoming, not familiarity, but the feeling of a place that has the right dimensions for something you have been carrying for a long time. She presented herself at the gate with every piece of certainty she possessed. Seraphine Ashwood, Omega rank, unaffiliated with the Alpha King's court as of 3 days prior, by her own choice and without his permission, carrying a response to the diplomatic summons King Draven's Soul had sent, also presenting herself as a candidate for the proposed alliance, should that still be a live possibility. She had 3 languages the Dragon territories were known to need translation in, 8 years of detailed knowledge of the Alpha King's internal court politics, and the Moon Seal, which she understood the Dragon scholarship had long considered significant even when the wolf world had not. She met the guards' eyes when they looked at each other. They let her in. She waited in an antechamber for nearly an hour. High ceilings of carved black stone, small persistent fires in iron brackets along the walls, the mineral warmth of the palace present in the air even here, near the entrance. She drank the water an attendant brought. She sat with her hands loose in her lap and did not fidget. When Draven's soul walked through the far doors, alone, wearing plain dark clothes with the specific ease of someone who has never needed the costume, because the authority is the person and not the garment, she stood, and she spoke first. She laid out everything, directly, without the softening that 8 years in a wolf court had taught her to reflexively apply. Who she was, and what she wanted, and what she was offering, and what she would need in return. When she finished, she looked at his face and read it the way she had learned to read faces, not for approval, just for information. He had listened to all of it without a single interruption. Then he looked at the moon seal. It was visible above her collar, the silver catching the bracket fires, doing the quiet luminous thing it always did in available light. He looked at it for a long moment with an expression she could not fully read, which was unusual and therefore noted. She was very good at reading expressions. "What does it feel like?" he said. "The mark. From the inside." No one had ever asked her that. She breathed in once. "Warm," she said, "like something that has been holding heat for a long time from a source I cannot locate. Not painful. Just present. The way a thing is present when it's been there so long that you'd recognize its absence before you'd recognize the thing itself. A small, precise nod. Like a person checking something against an internal record they have been keeping for a long time. "Sit down," he said. "We have a great deal to discuss." He was not what she had expected, though she would have struggled to define what she had expected, which told her something about how little she had allowed herself to imagine this moment fully. He was tall and very still. Still in the way, deep water is still not absent, not empty, containing something substantial that does not announce itself. His eyes were the exact amber of the firestone veins running through the palace walls, which she would later come to understand was genuinely not coincidental. The dragon bloodlines were old enough, and the bond between them and their land was old enough, that the physical and the elemental had grown into each other in ways that were literal rather than metaphorical. His face held the quality of someone who had learned, across a great deal of time, to be careful about what he let it show. Not cold, not warm in the easy, performed way. Present, when his attention was turned on you, it had a specific weight, the difference between a room with general overhead lighting and a room with a lamp directed at one particular thing. His court was cautious of her. She understood and did not blame them. She had arrived without formal credentials, without escort, without the standard diplomatic architecture of a legitimate representative. Draven's chief foreign advisor, a man named Ashen, thin and precise, with the energy of someone who spent a great deal of time calculating things, watched her through the first several meetings the way you watch a structural element you are not certain is load-bearing. She met his eyes without comment. The best response to being assessed is to be exactly what you are and let the assessment settle wherever the truth takes it. She was given quarters, small and clean and warmer than she expected, the firestone in the walls doing low constant work. She was given access to the treaty library, larger and older than she had anticipated, and spent 3 hours on her first evening sitting on the floor with 3 books open around her, reading, feeling something ease in her chest that she hadn't quite realized was tightened. Draven met with her daily, always with purpose, always with the specific quality of a conversation that is moving towards something, rather than simply occupying time. He asked about the Alpha King's court, its internal politics, its alliances, its pressure points, what it valued, and how it demonstrated value. He asked about the moon seal, not as a diplomatic instrument, but with the focused curiosity of a person who finds something genuinely interesting and wants to understand it on its own terms. She told him things she had not told anyone, about the morning her mother had set the teacup down on the dresser without looking at where she was setting it, about 8 years of scholars noting the seal and then setting it aside, about what it felt like to carry something that the world around it had decided not to take seriously, and to carry it anyway, and to slowly stop being sure that you were right not to agree with them. She did not perform these disclosures. She was not a person who performed vulnerability. She simply found, in those daily conversations, that she was in a room with enough space in it for her to be as large as she actually was, and she had not been in a room like that for a very long time, and it turned out she had quite a lot to say when the space was available. He listened without interpreting, without the specific nodding that signals a person has filed what you are saying and is simply waiting for you to finish. When she spoke, he was there, actually in the conversation, and when she stopped, he asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he had heard exactly what she said and was now examining it from a direction she hadn't considered. On the third evening, when the fires in the treaty room had burned low and the palace had settled into its particular quiet, she told him that she had spent a long time learning to be small. "I know," he said. "That's not an apology," she said. "I'm not sorry for the adaptation. It was appropriate to the circumstances. She looked for the precise words the way she looked for precise translations. Not forcing, waiting for the right shape. I did not understand how much effort it was costing until I stopped. What does it feel like to stop? Like a room with a higher ceiling." He was quiet for a moment. The specific quality of his quiet, she had learned, was different from absence. It was occupied quiet, the quiet of someone processing rather than waiting. Then he said, "My father's court was very loud. Everything was performance. Power as costume, the louder the color, the more authority the gesture was supposed to carry. I spent most of my young life making myself smaller than the space I occupied because I wanted to understand how the room actually worked instead of being caught up in the theater of it." It was the most personal thing he had offered her in all the weeks of their conversations. She understood, from the slight adjustment in his posture when he said it, the specific adjustment of a person setting something down that they do not often put down, that it was not a small thing. "I like this court," she said, "the quiet of it." "Good," he said, with the simple directness of a man who has decided something. "You should stay in it." Vale descended into the lower archives on the morning of the third day and did not come back up for 3. Vale was the palace's oldest living scholar, ancient in a way that no one at court could put a precise number on, slight as dry paper, eyes with the quick precision of something that has been tracking detail for a very long time and has no intention of stopping. She had been in the antechamber when Seraphine arrived. She had sat in the far corner of every meeting since, saying nothing, watching with the specific quality of attention that is not passive but is not aggressive, a scientist in the field, noting, not yet ready to conclude, but knowing exactly what she is noting. On the morning of the third day she had leaned forward in her chair, looked across the room at the moon seal, and gone very still. Then she had excused herself quietly and gone into the lower archives. She emerged on the morning of the 7th day with a book, the oldest physical object Seraphine had ever been in the same room with. No title on the cover. The material something between leather and something she could not name, worn smooth by the handling of many careful hands over many decades. The pages inside the color of ivory going to gold at the edges, the ink still dark despite the age of everything around it, the script dense, mixing at least 3 languages she recognized and at least 2 she had not yet encountered. Vale placed it on the table between Seraphine and Draven and 2 of the advisors, and opened it to a page near the center, with the confidence of someone who has spent 3 days reading and knows precisely where the passage that matters begins. "The moon seal," Vale said, in her direct way. She had long since shed any interest in softening information for audiences, "is not a wolf marking." She let that sit for a moment. The accounts that identify it as such, and there are several, all within the wolf historical tradition, all dating from approximately the 4th and 5th centuries, are copies of much older material. They were transcribed by wolf scholars who were working from a source text they did not fully understand, and they interpreted what they found through their own hierarchical lens. What the original source describes is not a fated mate bond within the wolf bloodline. The term in the original language translates most precisely as bridge-born, a soul carrying the capacity to seal the covenant between the 2 eldest supernatural bloodlines. She turned the book toward them. "Wolf and dragon. The seal is not a wolf marking. It has never been a wolf marking. It appears in wolf family lines because the bridge-born occasionally manifests in wolf families, which is the historical source of the confusion, but the mark itself originates from the same ancient source as the draconic blood marks. They are counterparts, two expressions of the same old magic, designed specifically to recognize each other. No one spoke. "The wolf scholars," Seraphine said, with the careful tone of someone confirming what they think they've understood, read the original text and decided it described a wolf-fated mate bond because that was the lens they were reading through. "They read it through the only lens they had available," Vale said. "It was not malicious, it was limited. That distinction matters, perhaps. What matters more is that the original text is not ambiguous. The Bridgeborn is not defined by rank or bloodline or wolf hierarchy position. It is defined by the seal." She looked at Seraphine's collarbone directly, which is, as documented across 4 historical instances in this text, quite specific in its appearance and its function. "What is its function?" Draven asked. "The texts record 4 historical Bridgeborns. In each instance where the bond was honored, it produced a period of sustained peace between the wolf and dragon territories. The duration of that peace extended beyond the Bridgeborn's own lifetime in every recorded case. The text describes the covenant as held in the blood rather than in the document, living rather than inscribed, unbreakable by the mechanisms that typically dissolve treaties." "And when it wasn't honored?" Seraphine asked. Vale looked at her directly. "The texts don't track individual outcomes for the Bridgeborn themselves. They record simply that the peace did not come." Seraphine looked down at the mark on her collarbone. Warm, steady, present. The thing Kalen had laughed at in a half-lit room with someone he was comfortable with. The thing the High Advisor had filed under no further action required. The thing her mother had wept over before she had the words to explain what she was weeping about. 8 years of carrying it in a world that had decided for its own convenience that it meant nothing. "It was real," she said, "not to anyone in particular, not to the room, to the seal itself maybe, or to the part of her that had spent 8 years trying to decide whether to believe in something the world around her had decided wasn't worth believing in. It was real, the entire time." "Yes," Vale said, simply, completely, with the specific directness of someone who has looked at the evidence and is not interested in cushioning the conclusion. "It was." What grew between Seraphine and Draven over the weeks that followed was not the fated bond. She was careful about this. She examined it carefully and often, the way you examine a wound, to understand whether it is healing or something else, and each time she examined it she came to the same conclusion. What was growing between them was different in kind from the bond she had with Kalen, not just different in quality. The fated mate bond was something that had happened to her, given without consultation, maintained without choice. Impossible to leave behind even when the person it connected her to had decided to treat it as furniture. This was something else. This was chosen, built, assembled over conversations and silences, and the specific intimacy of 2 careful people deciding, separately and then together, that they trusted each other enough to be less careful. He did not try to claim her. He did not perform desire or urgency, or the particular forward-leaning energy of a man who has decided he wants something and is arranging the situation toward getting it. He gave her room to be as large as she actually was, to have opinions that were hers, to know things that were useful and let them be useful, to take up the space she actually occupied rather than the smaller, more manageable space the world had been asking her to inhabit. She found this, initially, more difficult than expected. She had spent 8 years becoming very good at making herself smaller. The habit ran deep. It had become, over time, something close to instinct. The automatic adjustment, the reflexive monitoring, the constant low-level checking of whether she was taking up too much room, speaking too long, having too strong an opinion. She caught herself doing it in conversations with Draven in the first weeks, beginning a sentence and then trimming it, starting to say something and then editing it down to its most modest possible form, answering his questions with answers that were smaller than the truth, because smaller answers had historically been safer, he noticed. He did not point it out directly, which would have felt like correction, which would have made her smaller still. Instead, he asked follow-up questions. He asked, What else? Or, is that the whole of it? Or simply waited, in the specific quality of his waiting, until she understood that the room still had space, and she had not yet filled it. It was a very small thing. It was not a small thing at all, she told him, on an evening when the treaty room had gone quiet, and the fires had burned low, and there was the specific ease in the air that she had only recently learned to stop being suspicious of, that she had spent a long time learning to be small. I know, he said. That's not an apology, she said. I'm not apologizing for it. It was the right adaptation to the circumstances. I just don't know that I understood how much effort it was costing until I stopped. What does it feel like to stop? Like a room with a higher ceiling, she said. He was quiet for a moment, his occupied quiet, the quiet of processing. Then, my father's court was loud. Everything performed, power as costume. The louder the gesture, the more real the authority was supposed to be. I spent most of my young life making myself smaller than the space I occupied technically, because I wanted to be able to understand how the room actually worked, instead of being caught in the theater of it. It was the most personal thing he had offered. She understood, from the specific quality of the stillness that settled after he said it, the way certain moments settle after the thing that matters most has been said, that it cost him something, that he had put something down he did not often put down. I like this court, she said. The quiet of it. Good, he said, simply, with the directness of a man who has made a decision and is not interested in dressing it up. You should stay in it. He came on the 14th day. She had not expected that. She had expected letters. The second letter, the more formal third letter, the escalating diplomatic language of courts trying to assert authority they are not certain they still hold. She had not expected Kalen Voss to ride 3 days south with a small delegation and present himself at the Dragon Palace gate. She heard about his arrival before she saw him. An attendant came to find her in the treaty library looking slightly uncertain, which she had not seen before from the Dragon Court staff. She closed her book, straightened, let herself feel whatever she was feeling, which turned out to be, after a careful internal check, something close to steadiness. Not fear, not longing, not the terrible specific hope she might have felt 3 weeks earlier, before the corridor, before the road south, before the Valley and Vales book and the conversations in the treaty room. Something more like ground under your feet after a long time spent on uncertain footing. She went to meet him. He looked like Kalen. This is a simple observation and also not a simple one. She had been gone long enough and had been in a different enough environment to see him now with something closer to clarity than familiarity. He looked like power that had been given rather than built. The ease of someone who had never been seriously doubted by anyone whose doubting would have mattered. Wearing authority the way a person wears clothing that was tailored specifically for them and has never needed adjustment. He was tired from the road, which she could see, and slightly undone by the tiredness in a way she had not seen before, which told her something about the difference between this encounter and all their previous ones. He also looked, and this was what surprised her, uncertain, not in any dramatic way. A hairline fracture in the certainty, small enough that she would not have recognized it if she hadn't been paying a different kind of attention than she had ever been able to pay before. They were given a private room. Draven was absent from it, which was exactly right, and she understood from the thoughtfulness of his absence that he had considered what she needed and arranged accordingly. Kalen sat across from her. He said several things. Some of them were almost apologies. Some of them were explanations. Some occupied the difficult middle territory between those two things, where a person is acknowledging that something occurred without fully accepting their own part in the shape of it. He said he had not known the full significance of the seal. He said that the conversation she had overheard had been, he stopped. He started again. He said, the conversation you apparently overheard, and then he paused, and she watched him catch himself, and he said simply, the conversation you overheard. She gave him credit for that. He said he had formally withdrawn Lyrian's position from the court. He said he was prepared to formally acknowledge the bond, to make it, for the first time in 8 years of not making it, an official and acknowledged thing. He said, not in words, but in the arrangement of everything he was offering, that he was prepared, now, to take her seriously. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I have one question," she said. "Ask it. If you had known I was in that corridor, if you had known I was there, listening, would you have said it differently?" He opened his mouth. He closed it. The pause was 4 seconds. Maybe 5, and in those seconds she watched the answer arrive in his face before it reached his mouth, and the answer was not the simple, clean no that might once, in a different conversation she was no longer capable of having, have mattered to her. The answer was something more complicated and more honest than no. The face of a man confronting the gap between who he is when no one is watching and who he would be if they were, and finding the gap larger than he had known. "I see," she said. "Seraphine, I'm not asking you to defend yourself," she said. "I don't want an apology. I want you to understand why I am saying no." She looked at him directly, the way she had learned to look at people since she stopped managing the look for their comfort. The laugh was possible because the ease was real, because you were so genuinely settled in your assessment of what I was and wasn't worth, that the laugh came without effort, without thought. "I understand that you didn't intend cruelty. I understand the distinction between cruelty and indifference." She paused. "I simply do not experience the distinction in the outcomes, and I am not willing to spend the rest of my life in a place that requires me to hope the assessment shifts." He did not argue. He sat with it. He looked at the table for a long moment, and then back at her, and he said, "I understand." "Good," she said. And she meant it. The treaty signing was held 22 days after Seraphine arrived at the Dragon Court. Both courts present in the Great Hall, the Dragon Kingdom's advisors and scholars on one side, the delegation Kaelin had brought from the north on the other. Vale in the scholar's seat with the old book and her specific sharp eyes, the formal language prepared and ready to be read aloud in 2 tongues at once. Seraphine stood at the center, Draven beside her. She was not nervous. She was completely present, which is a different state and a better one. The words were read, ancient words in 2 languages, Vale reading the dragon text, one of the northern scholars reading the wolf tongue, both reaching the same phrase at the same moment, Bridgeborn witness. And then, the seal woke, not painfully, exactly as Vale had said it would not be. A heat that moved from warm to focused to bright in the span of 3 seconds, and then the light, real silver, not the faint shimmer of ordinary moments but a steady brightness visible across the full width of the hall, certain and unhurried and completely without apology. And from Draven's forearm his blood mark answered, old fire gold, usually invisible in daylight, now rising to meet the silver across the air between them, the way 2 notes find the chord they have always belonged to. The hall went absolutely silent. The particular silence of people watching something that they had, in their own private calculations, in the part of their mind where they keep the things they have decided probably aren't real. Decided was probably not real. She looked down at the mark on her collarbone. Steady, certain, real in the way it had always been real, the way it had been real every single morning of 8 years, while the world around it made its choices about whether to look. There you are, she thought. You were here the entire time. They married on a morning when the valley held a particular quality of amber light, the kind that arrives at a low angle in certain seasons, that touches the things it finds rather than simply illuminating them. Not the traditional white of wolf bonding ceremonies, not the gold of dragon unions. Something entirely her own, found in a small shop in the palace's lower town, that fit her in the specific way things fit when you have stopped dressing for other people's comfort and started dressing for your own. She left the neckline open. 20 people. The inner courtyard with the single red-leafed tree growing in volcanic soil. Vale reading the old words. Draven saying his vows in the wolf tongue he had learned in a month with the specific focus of a person who does not do things part way. Her saying hers in the bridge language, the one Vale had spent 2 weeks teaching them both, the one that had not been spoken formally in 300 years, both of them saying the final words together. He placed his hand against her cheek for a moment, very quietly, not for the room, for her. The specific gesture of a private person making a private choice. She leaned into it, by exactly as much as she wanted to, which was quite a lot. Here is what Seraphine learned. in the year and then the years after that. She learned that what she had spent 8 years calling patience had been something more specific and more painful than patience. It had been the particular stillness of someone who has been told, not in words, never in words, but in every available arrangement of every available room, that the correct response to being underestimated is to wait quietly until the underestimation corrects itself. She had been patient the way a door is patient, stationary, functional, opened by other people, not consulted about its own destination. She was not that kind of patient anymore. She learned that being a bridge did not mean being transparent. She had assumed, in the early weeks of understanding what the seal meant, that the role of a bridge-born was to diminish herself so that the two things being connected could pass through her without friction. She went back to the old texts and read all 4 historical accounts carefully, and then the supplementary material Vale guided her to in the deeper archive, and what she found consistently was not women who had made themselves smaller. They were described as people of strong character, specific opinion, deep particularity. One of them was described in terms Seraphine would later have translated for her as the most stubborn person in 2 kingdoms, which is why the peace lasted. That was the point. A bridge with no substance of its own is not a bridge. It is a gap with optimistic intentions, and gaps do not hold the weight of anything. She learned that Draven was not always easy to understand. He did not explain himself often. He did not narrate his internal states or signal his moods with the kind of legibility that made other people easy to read. There were evenings when she sat with him in the treaty room or the inner courtyard and could not tell, with any certainty, what was happening in the space behind his eyes. She had learned, in the wolf court, to interpret silence as absence, to read quiet as indifference, stillness as being overlooked. With Draven she had to learn, slowly and with some resistance, that his quiet was occupied, that his stillness was attention, that the absence of noise was not the absence of presence. She was not always easy to understand either. She had spent 8 years building careful interior walls, not out of cruelty or calculation, but out of the specific self-protection of someone who has learned that showing too much is dangerous, in a place where what you show can be used to determine what you're worth. She had learned to keep the most important things in the deepest rooms. This had protected her for a long time. It had also made her, she came to understand, somewhat difficult to fully know, even for people who genuinely wanted to. "You do the thing with your face," Draven told her one evening, in the flat, direct manner he used when he was naming something precisely. "When something matters to you more than you want to show. Your expression stays the same, but there is this adjustment around the eyes, like you have decided to close a door." She looked at him. "I am not asking you to open it," he said. "I am telling you that I notice it, and that I would rather know what is on the other side than pretend I haven't seen the door." She thought about that for a long time. Then she started, slowly and without ceremony, opening doors. It was not a smooth process. It was not the process of someone who had decided to be fully known and was proceeding bravely and directly toward full disclosure. It was the process of someone who had kept certain rooms locked for so long that she had almost forgotten what was in them, who had to open each one and stand in the doorway for a moment before she could tell whether what was inside was something she could let into the light. Some of it was. Some of it needed more time. Some of it surprised her with how small and harmless it was when she finally looked at it directly. Draven did not rush the process. He waited at the doorways the way he waited in conversations, attentively, without pressure, making it clear that he was there and was not going anywhere. She found this, over time, the most quietly remarkable thing about him. It took longer than she expected to dismantle the habit of smallness. The habit had run deep. 8 years of automatic adjustment. Am I taking up too much room? Am I speaking too long? Is my opinion unwelcome here? Is my presence inconvenient in this moment? Had become something close to reflex, something that happened below the level of decision. She caught herself doing it for months after the wedding, beginning a sentence and trimming it, starting to say something with full conviction and then, automatically, reducing it to its most modest possible form before it left her mouth. She noticed it each time she chose differently. Over time, the reflex weakened, quieted, became finally just a memory of a way she used to be, a habit she could observe with some historical curiosity rather than one she was still living inside. It was worth every moment of the work. The treaty deepened over the years into something more substantial than the document it had started as. The trade agreements were renegotiated in the second year, with Seraphine running the sessions in 2 languages, and the resulting terms were better for both kingdoms than either had managed alone in the years prior. 3 territorial conflicts between smaller regional holdings were resolved in formal mediations she led. The scholar community in both kingdoms produced a joint historical study of the Bridge-born across both bloodlines' records, which corrected 3 centuries of mistranslation, and which Seraphine reviewed carefully and added 7 pages of notes to, because she had opinions about the scholarship, and the scholarship deserved to have them. She was good at all of it. This surprised no one who had been paying attention. Several courts had not been paying attention. She found a small, private, completely honest satisfaction in their surprise, and she let herself find it without apologizing for it, which was itself a kind of progress. The young attendant Riva, who had been 17 and transparently curious when Seraphine arrived, became over the years a junior scholar in the palace's historical archive. She had a specific gift for cross-language textual analysis that Vale had identified and cultivated, and she credited Seraphine, in the dedication of her first published monograph on the Bridge-born historical records, with being the first person who told her that having specific opinions about things was not a flaw requiring correction, but a skill requiring development. Seraphine read the dedication and then put the monograph down and looked at the ceiling for a long moment and thought about her mother, who had told her to be careful, and understood for the first time that what her mother had meant was not be careful with the seal, but be careful with yourself. Protect what is in you, because it is worth protecting. She had been careful for a long time in the wrong direction. She had been careful with herself the way you are careful with something fragile, handling it gently, keeping it out of strong light, protecting it from impact. She had not understood, until she stopped, that the alternative to fragile was not broken. The alternative was solid, substantial, something that does not need to be kept in a cabinet because it can hold its own weight in the open. Kalen returned north and governed. He was competent at it. The court he ran would change over the years, in ways she heard about second-hand and across a considerable distance, and she felt nothing in particular about any of it. Not bitterness, not satisfaction, the specific nothing of a person who has put down something heavy and is no longer tracking where it landed because she has other things to carry now, things she chose, things that weigh the right amount, things whose weight means something. The moon seal became across both kingdoms the subject of considerable scholarly attention. Vale supervised most of it, which meant it was done with appropriate rigor, and that anyone who attempted to be sloppy about the historical evidence was met with the specific quality of Vale's disapproval, which was not loud but was extremely thorough. Seraphine sat for 6 formal interviews over the course of the first year, and contributed what she knew, and gently but firmly corrected what the scholars got wrong. She had very specific opinions about the scholarship. The opinions were respected. This still surprised her slightly. In the first year, she was working on being less surprised. On the evenings when the moon sat full and low and heavy over the valley, pressing its particular quality of light against everything it found, the firestone walls of the palace receiving it and holding it and returning it slowly, the amber veins glowing from within, the black stone breathing warmth from deep below the surface, as it always did and had always done since before anyone now living was born, she would stand at the window and watch the way it all moved together. The light and the stone and the warmth, all part of the same system, all connected, all doing the same thing at different registers, the way everything in this valley was connected at the level below the visible. The seal caught the moonlight, silver and steady and warm, the way it had been on the first morning it appeared, when she was 17 and her mother had set the teacup down on the dresser without looking at where she was setting it. The way it had been through 8 years of being told, in every available way except the direct one, that it meant nothing. The way it had been in the East Corridor, when she heard the laugh and felt the specific sensation of a belief releasing its grip. The way it had been on the mountain road, and at the valley's edge, and in the antechamber when Draven had looked at it and asked what it felt like from the inside. The first time anyone had asked her that. The first time anyone had treated her internal experience as information worth having. Unchanged by all of it. Patient not in the way she had been patient. Not waiting for acknowledgement. Not managing itself against someone else's dismissal. Not making itself smaller in the hope of eventually being allowed to be larger, but patient in the way the earth is patient. Simply and firmly and undeniably itself. The way things are when they know what they are and do not require agreement from the room in order to keep being it. Draven's hand found the small of her back. Not possessive. Not a claim or a statement or an arrangement for anyone else's benefit. Just present. Just there. Just the warm, specific weight of a person who has chosen to be near you and is demonstrating the choice simply, without theater, without needing it to be witnessed to be real. She leaned into it, by exactly as much as she wanted, which was, it turned out, which she was learning, every day, to let herself believe without checking it against anything, without editing it down to a smaller and safer version, quite a lot, which was in fact everything. The valley held them both. The fire gold answered the silver. The peace held in the blood rather than the document, exactly as the old text had promised it would, patient and real and deep, exactly the way she had always been, exactly the way the mark on her collarbone had always been, exactly the way she was finally, completely, unapologetically allowing herself to be. She had been real the whole time. She had simply needed a room where the ceiling was high enough to show it. She had needed to be the one to find the room. She had. And here is the final thing, the thing that took the longest to learn, the thing that she would not have been able to understand if someone had told it to her on the morning the seal appeared, or on the mountain road south, or even in the first weeks in the valley. The room did not have a high ceiling because she had found the right people. The room did not have a high ceiling because she had finally been given permission. The room had a high ceiling because she had stopped carrying the ceiling with her. She had been the one lowering it, all along. She had internalized the dimensions of a space too small for her, and then moved through every subsequent room, measuring herself against them, adjusting herself downward to fit. Draven had not given her a higher ceiling. He had simply declined to hand her a lower one, which had given her the room to notice what she had been doing, and to stop. That was, she came to understand, the specific and irreplaceable thing he had offered. Not rescue, not validation, not the specific drama of being seen by someone who had first refused to see her, which would have been its own trap, its own version of measuring herself against someone else's judgment. He had offered something quieter and harder to name. The ordinary decency of a room where she was not required to be smaller than she was, and the patience to wait while she figured out how large that actually was. She was still figuring it out. She expected she would be for a long time. People who have spent years compressing do not decompress all at once. The process is gradual and sometimes surprising. She would find, periodically, some new thing she had been keeping small that she had not even realized she was keeping small, and she would look at it, and she would let it be larger, and it would be fine. It was always fine. Things that are genuinely yours are almost always fine when you let them be the size they actually are. The seal on her collarbone burned silver in the moonlight over the valley. The fire gold answered from Draven's arm. The peace ran in the blood of both kingdoms, patient and real. She pressed her fingers against the mark, the way she had on the night everything changed. Sitting on the edge of her bed looking at her hands. The warmth was there. It had always been there. It would always be there. Not because she had finally done something to deserve it. Not because she had found the right room or the right person or the right set of circumstances, but because it was hers. Because it had always been hers. Because some things simply are what they are, and they wait, and they do not require the world to agree in order to keep being real. Her mother had told her to be careful. She had been careful, for a long time, in the wrong direction. She was careful now in the right one, careful with her own worth, careful with what she knew, careful about letting anyone, including herself, convince her that the correct posture was small. The valley was quiet. The palace breathed its slow warmth. She stood at the window, and she was, entirely and without apology, herself. The end.